When you're a young man, elves are Santa's little helpers, and they make all the toys that you get on Christmas, and that makes you very happy. But due to the internet, when you grow older, at some point in your life, inexplicably, girls start to put on elf ears and wear costumes, and then you get very confused about what you find attractive. I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome to the Lore Lodge. So, unless you grew up in a rather odd society, family, cult, I don't know, your first introduction to elves was most likely through Santa Claus. And Santa's elves are these nice, helpful little creatures who are performing slave labor to give all the little boys and girls all over the world stuff from Walmart. So, point of that being, your introduction to elves comes from Christmas movies and everything, and you think about elves as these diminutive little creatures who just go about their day working and helping out in exchange for, scraps of meals and whatnot, and getting to have this blind, devoted loyalty to a fat man who inexplicably is not bound by the laws of time. So, when you get a little bit older and you're introduced to The Hobbit, you get a little bit of whiplash regarding what elves are. And it doesn't help when you watch or read Harry Potter and elves are kind of like hobgoblins. But, if you want to know what a hobgoblin is, go back and watch our last lore video because we went in depth on it. But elves in J.K. Rowling's universe, very diminutive as well. Really, it seems like these are mostly gnomes or goblins that we're dealing with. So we got to kind of go back. These are the modern interpretations of elves. These are the newest interpretations of elves. So what are the original elves? Well, to answer that question, there's really two groups you can look to, and that is the Alfheim elves of Nordic tradition, which we don't really know much about. They seem to be a creation above humans, but not the same as Jotnar, and they live on their own plane of Alfheim, and they are ruled over by the Vanir. And the Vanir are, of course, the Norse fertility gods. These are gods who are much more associated with nature and the finer things rather than war and civilization. And the Norse gods have a tendency to balance one another out. But these elves we don't hear much about. What we get is that they're kind of superhuman. They get a lot more power. Sometimes they have dominion over certain realms of nature, and they get their own part of Yggdrasil that is set apart from everybody else. And they don't really factor into the stories of Ragnarok or really any of the Norse sagas. We don't know what they thought of elves other than that they were like, yep, elves exist. Elves are out there. So a more fleshed out version of what we have for elves comes from the Irish tradition. And unfortunately, much of this has been lost during the Christianizing period of Irish history. Now, that's not to say that Christianity is in any way a negative influence on history. It's just that in order to make Christianity more palatable to people in pagan lands, they had to adopt pagan gods as saints and change up their origin stories to match up with the Bible. And this meant, to a large extent, washing away some of the original content. And some of it can be recovered by examining ancient poetry and reading through loan words from Irish to Welsh and kind of reconstructing what different terms might have meant. But what we get is that the Irish elves, the fair folk, are a group called the Tuatha Dé Danann. And the Tuatha Dé Danann are this special, super powerful group who are involved in the migration period into Ireland, as is described in the Leva Gaval na Éireann. Now, the Leva Gaval na Éireann is a Christian work that is the book of the invasions of Ireland. It is purporting to tell the story of who came to Ireland, when, and how this shaped the history of the land. Now, we don't have a ton of evidence suggesting that the Gaels were in Ireland before 500 BC, so it's hard to tell, But what we do have are very clear stories told by the Irish who resisted the conversion to Christianity as late as the 6, 7, 800s, that the Tuatha De Danann came from a different stock, a different race, and that they battled with a group of sea people called the Fomorians, and that over time they were outnumbered and outmatched by man and driven underground into the other world through the fairy mounds, the sea, the she, however you want to call them. This is where the term banshee comes from, woman of the she, woman of the fairy mound. But yeah, so in Irish mythology, and if you want to hear more on this, go back to our other video about other worlds, which I think is our 3rd or 4th episode. But the very basic version of this is if you go into a fairy mound, then you will end up in the other world. And the other world in Irish mythology is generally a little pocket dimension where you are within the domain of one Tua. And I should make it clear that each of the Tuas of Ireland, which are the kind of the kingdoms, the ancient petty kingdoms, there are 54 in Ireland that have their own Tua and their own fairy mound and their own other world. And the other worlds aren't necessarily connected. Now, if you go into Welsh mythology and you get into the Welsh version of this, they have some very similar things. You can get into the other world, but it much more mirrors Wales itself rather than being pocket dimensions. If you go into the other world, you're finding yourself in an underground space that very much is along the same lines as the world above, as above, so below, kind of like that. Now, not much is known about these Irish deities, these demigods, so to speak, that were, the Lug, the Derda, the Morgan. And I'll do another video where I'll go in depth on all of the main Irish demigods and deities. But what you need to know is that they were very powerful, they were worshipped, and they were seen as godlike figures, if not quite as gods. Now, the Celts did certainly have gods, but those looked more like Cernunnos, who was the horned god, who you see often depicted as being a masculine figure with stag's horns, and is depicted in a lot of Latin culture artifacts. But this all circles back and gets rolled up by one of my favorite guys to talk about, J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien took all of the various stories of elves and masterfully recrafted them into one race. And that one race is what he calls the Quendi. And the Quendi in the story of Tolkien awake in the east sometime after the creation of the world he has created, Arda, and they are discovered by the Valar as well as the Maiar. And again, these are all angelic beings and demigods and kind of like the archangels and whatnot. These elves split into 3 groups, the Minyar, the Tatyar, and the Nelyar. And these groups of elves decide to set off west under the guidance of one of the Valar, who leads them back to Aman. And along the way, some of them lag behind. They become the Teleri, and you get the Falathirim and the Noldor and the Eldar, and things split up quite a bit. You also get the Avari, who decide to stay behind. They're known as the Black Elves. They're not necessarily evil, but they're not taking part in everything that's going on to the west. So Tolkien's elves are a very distilled, very fleshed out version of these beings. And they are immortal. They cannot die of sickness or of age. They can be killed, however, in combat. You can kill them. They are super powerful. They are extremely good at music and fighting and archery. They are essentially perfect beings, so long as they do not fall to the whims of Sauron. They are also most likely to resist people like Sauron and Melkor, which makes them very, very, very important. Now, over time, Tolkien's sort of world and his realm takes all of these fantastical stories of elves battling Balrogs and orcs and all of these incredible things, and then everything comes to a climax in The Lord of the Rings as the time of the elves ends and the time of men begins. Now, elves in Lord of the Rings are essentially these angelic beings who are very much in tune with nature, who have free will, but are wiser and they live for much longer. So, where they desire peace and prosperity and some of the simpler things in life, they create a fantastic foil for men who, above all, crave power. So, elves are essentially, in Tolkien's mythology, a foil for mankind. Now, the I suppose the best way to put this is that the flaw of the elves in Tolkien's mythology is that they can be cold and calculating, and they don't care as much for those around them because they can always go back to Aman, back to the land of the Valar, and live forever in peace and harmony and comfort. And they, over time, because they've reached a certain point, they don't really see any need for progress. Whereas men, in the short lives they have to live, they seek adventure and they seek, to build wealth and to create these incredible stories. And that's what makes men special, despite all of their flaws. So that's kind of the intro to what elves are, what elves were in the early days of European consciousness, and what elves are in our modern sense. Whenever you go to any sort of media that has elves, you got to understand that they're probably going off of what Tolkien wrote, because he's the single most authoritative source on elves. And I mean, if you're going to pick something, Tolkien's really always the way to go. Now, I could spend the rest of this video bashing other fantasy authors, but instead what I'm going to do is just encourage everybody to read, listen to, or at the very least watch Lord of the Rings, because it is one of the most incredible journeys you could possibly go on through literature, and I have been a better person for it. The moral lessons, the sheer impressive nature of his writing is really something to behold. So I think I'm going to leave the video here. Once again, thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge. I'm Aidan Mattis. If you like what you saw, make sure to hit the notification bell, like, subscribe, share with a friend, sign up to our Patreon, follow us on TikTok, on Snapchat, whatever. I'm the Aidan Mattis on just about everything. He is Director Aidan on just about everything. And don't forget to follow me on Twitch. We're going to be doing a lot more Twitch streaming. We've actually been Twitch streaming this behind the scenes this whole time. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then stick around. We'll probably be doing some just chatting kind of stuff as well soon. So that's going to do it for today's video. I'm Aidan Mattis. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.